He always noticed the way the man looked at him, not with pity, not with recognition, but with something heavier, like he was trying to remember a dream that never stopped haunting him. Elijah had been delivering pastries to the Rosewood nursing home every morning before the bakery opened, and he never told anyone why. He just did it. Rain or shine, he parked at the same corner, entered through the side gate, and quietly placed a small box of croissants and butter rolls on the counter near the community room. Sometimes he added a note. "Good morning. I hope today feels a little lighter." No one asked where the food came from. Most assumed it was a donation from a local charity. But there was no name on the bag, no brand label. Only one man ever seemed to pay attention. The old man sat by the window in a wheelchair, always watching. He never spoke, he never touched the pastries, but every morning, without fail, he locked eyes with Elijah just for a moment. There was something unsettling about it, but not threatening. It was the way people look at tombstones or faded photographs of people they once knew but never dared to speak of again. Elijah was used to being invisible. Being a quiet person helped him disappear in rooms filled with noise. Being gay in the Deep South taught him early how to carry silence like armor. He found refuge in baking. It was simple, predictable, and forgiving, unlike people. The rise and fall of dough made more sense than the shifting expressions of family members who claimed to love him but never quite looked him in the eyes. At 28, Elijah had built a life that didn't ask for much. A small rented room above the bakery, a playlist of old jazz songs he never skipped, a ritual that gave his mornings purpose before customers arrived and the world resumed its usual pace. He never wanted recognition. He just wanted to feel like he existed in some quiet way that mattered to someone. But the way the man by the window stared, it began to unsettle that quiet. Not because it was hostile, but because it felt familiar. There was a photo Elijah kept hidden at the bottom of a drawer. It was the only image he had of his great-grandfather, Benjamin Knox, dressed in a faded army uniform, standing in front of a Jeep in what looked like Southeast Asia. No one in the family spoke of him. The official story was vague. He died young, in the war. Somewhere overseas, no grave, no ceremony, just silence. Elijah only knew about him because he once overheard a hushed argument between his uncle and father, something about disgrace, shame, and keeping his name out of it. But lately, every time the old man stared at him through the window, something in Elijah's memory whispered louder. Not words, just fragments of intuition that had nowhere to land. The feeling that something had been buried deep in his bloodline, and the stranger in the wheelchair held the shovel. He didn't ask questions. He didn't want to disturb whatever peace the man had left. But when the look in those aging eyes lingered longer than usual one morning, and the man mouthed something he couldn't quite hear, Elijah froze. He blinked, and the moment passed. But it was enough. That night, for the first time in years, Elijah went up to the attic of his childhood home. It was dusty, full of forgotten boxes, old coats, holiday lights that no one used anymore. He found a small wooden chest, unmarked, locked. When he cracked it open, inside was a bundle of old headers tied with string, faded ink, folded pages, and at the top, one envelope that had never been mailed. It had no stamp, no recipient address, just a name, Harold. If you believe some people carry truths their whole families tried to erase, stay with this story. The envelope was fragile, yellowed around the edges like it had been waiting for hands brave enough to open it. Elijah didn't tear it. He unfolded it slowly, carefully, like he was handling a piece of someone else's soul. The handwriting was neat but shaky, as if the person who wrote it had held too much in for too long. It wasn't dated, just one word written at the top in black ink. Harold. He read in silence, his breath tight in his chest. I don't know if you'll ever read this. Maybe I won't send it. Maybe I'll lose the courage, but I need you to know. You were the only thing that ever made me feel real out there. The letter spoke of nights under rain-soaked tents, of whispers shared between gunfire, of moments stolen between terror and duty. And buried in those paragraphs, raw and trembling, was a confession. They think I'm weak, Harold. They think men like me don't belong in uniform. Like courage only lives in the mouths of the loudest. But you saw me. You let me speak without shame. You held my hand when my own body was shaking. I don't know what that makes us in their eyes, but in mine, it made us human. Elijah stopped reading. His fingers trembled. He pressed the letter against his chest like it might anchor him to the floor. All this time, he thought his queerness was a lonely anomaly in a family tree full of stern faces and hollow pride. But there it was, in ink older than him. In a voice never spoken of, again proof that someone before him had loved like he did, and paid a price for it. He didn't sleep that night. He kept rereading the letter, memorizing the slope of every letter, the way the word real was underlined like it meant something more than most people could understand. By morning, he knew what he had to do. Elijah returned to the nursing home with the letter folded in his coat pocket. He waited until breakfast was done, until most of the residents had gone back to their rooms or daily routines. Only Harold remained, still by the window, still watching. Elijah walked over, the pastries left untouched behind him. He stood in front of the old man and said nothing for a long moment. Then, softly, he pulled the letter from his pocket and placed it on Harold's lap. The man didn't move. His fingers hovered above the page as if they already knew what was written. Harold opened the envelope with a kind of reverence Elijah hadn't seen in years. His eyes scanned the page. They didn't widen. They didn't fill with tears. Instead, they softened as if something inside him finally exhaled after holding its breath for decades. When he finished, he looked up at Elijah with a gaze that felt like a quiet homecoming. "You're his boy," Harold said, voice low and brittle. "I'd know those eyes anywhere." Elijah nodded. He couldn't find words. He didn't need to. Harold leaned back slowly, the letter still in his hand. "They told me he died overseas, that he stepped on a mine trying to rescue a comrade, but I knew that wasn't true. I knew they lied. There was too much shame in their silence." He paused. His gaze drifted out the window, watching something only he could see. Ben didn't die from war. He died from being erased. The room held its breath with him. They stripped his name from every file, burned his letters, told me to forget him. But I never could. And now you're here. Elijah wanted to scream or cry or hug this old man who held the missing piece of everything he had never understood. But he just stood there still, as Harold added, "Your grandfather was the bravest man I ever knew, not because of what he did on the battlefield, but because of who he dared to be in a world that couldn't stand to see him." For a long while, neither of them spoke. Elijah sat beside him. The clock ticked, the sun shifted, and the letter stayed open on Harold's lap, no longer a secret, but a bridge. Later that evening, as Elijah returned home, something in him had changed. He didn't feel small anymore. He didn't feel like a quiet mistake in a family that had long forgotten how to name what they didn't understand. He felt claimed, not by the bloodline that erased Benjamin's name, but by the truth that survived in hidden corners, passed down like flame between shadows. Elijah knew what he had to do next, not just for himself, but for the man whose love was buried, whose truth was stolen, and whose name deserved more than silence. If you've ever felt like a stranger in your own story, stay close. This is just beginning. Elijah had never dared ask his father about Benjamin. The few times he'd even mentioned his great-grandfather's name as a child, the room would grow cold. His father would grunt. His mother would clear the table a little faster than necessary, and the subject would drift away like it had never existed. But now, armed with truth wrapped in a worn letter, Elijah wasn't seeking permission. He was returning what had been stolen. That Sunday, during the usual family lunch, Elijah arrived early. The table was already set. His father stood at the grill, apron stained, beer in hand, the same way he had for years. His older brother tossed a football to one of his kids in the backyard. Everyone looked exactly the same, but Elijah felt different. He waited until everyone had taken a seat, waited until the hum of casual chatter gave him an opening. Then he placed a small envelope in the center of the table. "I found this," he said. "It belonged to Benjamin." The table fell silent. His father didn't reach for the envelope. His uncle did, but only after a pause long enough to feel like a warning. He unfolded the letter, scanned it quickly, then set it back down like it burned his skin. "I thought we agreed we wouldn't dig this up again," his father muttered. "He's been gone a long time. Let the dead rest." Elijah looked at him, unflinching. "He didn't die the way you said he did, and he wasn't the man you told us he was." "I told you what mattered," his father snapped. The mask of calm now cracked. He deserted his country, brought shame to this family. And no, Elijah interrupted quietly. "He loves someone. That's not shame. That's being human." His father's jaw tightened. The others didn't speak. Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph he'd found folded inside the same chest that held the letter. It was faded, but the image was clear. Two soldiers leaning against a jeep, laughing, one with a hand on the other's shoulder. Benjamin and Harold, smiling in a way that felt too alive to be erased. "He saved a man's life," Elijah continued, voice steady. "He lived with integrity, and he died with none of you knowing the full truth because it was too inconvenient for you to accept." His father stood, pushing back his chair. "You think you know better because of one letter and an old photo. We did what we had to do. He was going to destroy our name." "No," Elijah replied. "You destroyed his." That moment shattered something that had stood quietly in the corner of their family for decades, the illusion of honor built on silence. Elijah didn't yell. He didn't plead. He just stood there, holding truth in one hand and dignity in the other, and let the weight of it settle over the table like dust no one wanted to see. He left without finishing lunch. The next morning, Elijah returned to the nursing home with a fresh box of pastries and a quiet ache in his chest. He found Harold in the courtyard, sitting alone in the early sun. "They still hate him," Elijah said, placing the bottle on the bench beside them. "Even now." Harold nodded, his face unreadable. "Because he reminds them of what they're too afraid to admit. That love, real love, doesn't care who salutes you or who turns their back." He handed Elijah something wrapped in a cloth napkin. Inside was a metal scratched, unpolished, heavy with time. "It was his," Harold said. "He never got to wear it. They stripped it before the ceremony. Said it'd be better that way." Elijah held the metal in his hand. It wasn't just metal. It was memory, erased and returned. "Will you do something for me?" Harold asked, almost as a whisper. Elijah nodded. "Don't let them forget him again." Well, that night, Elijah opened his laptop and began writing. Not an article, not a rant, but a tribute. A story titled "The Name My Family Buried and the Man They Never Let Me Know." He shared it with no intention of going viral. He just wanted the truth to live somewhere other than in silence. He included the letter, the photograph, a picture of the medal. He ended it with one line: "If someone in your family disappeared from history, maybe it wasn't because they did something wrong, but because they did something right at the wrong time." By sunrise, the post had quietly begun to spread. And by nightfall, strangers from around the country had left hundreds of comments. Some shared their own family secrets. Some apologized for stories they once erased. Others simply wrote, "I see him now." Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can give someone is their name back. Stay close. There's still one more truth left to uncover. The article traveled farther than Elijah expected. By the end of the week, over 20,000 people had read his tribute. Comments flooded in, some from veterans, some from queer descendants, some from people who never knew how to mourn the ones their families had erased. One message stood out. It was short, no signature, just a line. "You should come to Building 47 at Fort Pine." Someone left a record they thought no one would ever ask for. Elijah stared at the message for hours before deciding. Fort Pine was nearly 4 hours away, an old decommissioned base that now functioned as a partial archive center for military records. He wasn't sure what he was walking into. But when silence is all you've known, Even the promise of truth becomes a kind of music. He arrived early. The air around the old compound was dry, still smelling faintly of machine oil and dust. A clerk behind the reception window glanced at the name Elijah scribbled on the visitor log, then disappeared into a room behind thick glass. Minutes later, a man in a faded green jacket stepped out. He looked close to 70, his posture too straight for retirement. "You're here about Benjamin Knox," he said. Elijah nodded. The man led him down a narrow corridor lined with metal cabinets. He unlocked a drawer that had likely been closed for decades. Inside was a single beige folder. "This file was marked for destruction twice," the man said. "But someone before me who knew him moved it, tucked it into an inactive personnel drawer. Under a false name, you wouldn't have found it without the right whisper." Elijah opened the folder slowly. There it was, a full record, deployment logs, training commendations, field evaluations that describe Benjamin as brilliant under pressure, strategic, reliable, and respected by his men. And then at the bottom of the last page, stamped in red ink, morally unfit on, discharge recommended. Elijah's throat tightened. Attached behind that page was a single handwritten note. Unlike the rest of the military forms, this one was personal. It read, "Corporal Knox was found to be in violation of conduct regulations due to private correspondence with a fellow soldier. However, his bravery in the field saved 9 lives during Operation Glassline. The undersigned believes his actions warrant reconsideration, and that his personal life, while at odds with prevailing standards, does not negate his service or sacrifice." It was signed in Major R. Dempsey. Elijah didn't know who Dempsey was, but in that moment, the letter felt like the lone light someone had tried to keep alive against an avalanche of silence. He left Fort Pine with a copy of the file, his hands trembling around the paper as if holding a ghost. The words, though decades old, carved something open inside him. It was no longer just about Benjamin. It was about the cost of every erasure, about the veterans who came home and were told they didn't belong, about the ones who never got to come home at all. Elijah returned to Savannah with a plan. He reached out to the local VA office, contacted a small LGBTQ+ veterans network he'd found online, and he brought the story, Benjamin's story, into every room that would listen. Within weeks, they organized a small gathering. Not a parade, not a press event, just a circle of chairs in the community center hall. Veterans, activists, historians, and people like Elijah, descendants of the forgotten. At the center of the room, Elijah placed Benjamin's photograph, his medal, and a printed copy of the letter Harold had guarded for half his life. One by one, people shared stories of uncles who were never spoken of again, of medals that had no names, of service and silence, of love and loss. When it was Elijah's turn, he didn't speak from notes. He just said, "My family taught me to be quiet. My country taught my grandfather to disappear. But somewhere between those silences, a man lived with courage that outlasted their shame. I don't want applause. I just want his name to stand. Somewhere." A week later, the mayor's office called. They had read the article. The city council had read it too. And one council member whose brother had been dishonorably discharged in 1994 for the same reason put forward a motion. They would dedicate a small bench in the public square, facing the war memorial, with a plaque that simply read, "In memory of those who served with honor and loved without permission, this seat is for you." Elijah wept the day it was installed, not for Benjamin, but for every man and woman who never got a bench, never got a file pulled from the fire, never got their name back, but still in the quiet spaces lived whole and unshaken. The bench became more than Elijah expected. It started with a few flowers left by strangers. Then came the notes, folded slips of paper tucked under the plaque, written in shaky handwriting. "This one's for my brother, who loved a man in secret. For my aunt, dishonorably discharged, never dishonorably loved. For the soldier I kissed goodbye in '67 and never saw again. Each morning, Elijah stopped by before the bakery opened. He'd wipe the bench clean, remove the wilted petals, and keep the most heartfelt letters in a wooden box beneath his counter. The rest he let go, carried off by wind or rain, as if the world itself had agreed to remember quietly. But remembrance wasn't enough. Not for Elijah, not anymore. He reached out to Harold one last time. The man was growing frail, now confined to his room, sunlight only reaching him through narrow blinds. Elijah brought with him a plan, a request. "I want to name the bakery after him," Elijah said. Not just in tribute. I want people to ask, who was Ben? I want the story to be told out again and again, through cinnamon rolls and sourdough, through small kindnesses and quiet strength. I want to make a place where no one gets erased." Harold didn't answer at first. He just held Elijah's hand. When he finally spoke, it came in a whisper. "Then make it loud, son. Make it so loud they can't pretend not to hear it anymore." And so he did. A month later, the sign went up, Knox and Crumb, a bakery for the forgotten. Underneath in smaller letters, in memory of Benjamin Knox, a soldier, a lover, a man worth remembering. The response was immediate. Some neighbors crossed the street to avoid it. Others brought their children and pointed at the sign with curiosity. Tourists took photos. A local journalist wrote a small column, then a bigger one. And one morning, as Elijah wiped down the bakery windows, a man in uniform entered the shop. He was older, his gait stiff, eyes heavy with distance. He didn't order anything. He simply placed a single medal on the counter. "I served with someone like him," he said. "They made me lie about it for 40 years. He nodded once, picked up a cinnamon roll, and left. Elijah stared at the medal. He didn't know the man's name. He didn't need to. Because by then, Knox and Crumb had become more than a bakery. It was a living archive of love and service, and silence finally broken. Veterans visited. Teenagers came in just to ask about the soldier on the wall. Elijah kept Benjamin's photo there, framed above the oven, beside Harold's original letter. Every tray of pastries was baked beneath it. Every customer handed a piece of history with their receipt, whether they knew it or not. Elijah no longer flinched when people asked about his family. He no longer avoided mirrors or dodged questions about who he was, because he knew he came from a man who loved, even when it cost him everything. And that love had survived, not because it was easy, not because it was accepted, but because someone chose not to forget. And now, in the smell of warm bread, in the handwritten notes that still appear on the bench, in the eyes of children who ask curious questions, Benjamin Knox lives again. One morning, Elijah stood outside the bakery as the sun rose behind the bench. A teenager passed by, paused, and asked, "Hey, who was Ben?" Elijah smiled. "He was someone who mattered," he said. "And now, you know, because that's all any of us are really asking for. To be seen, to be remembered, to matter." Has someone in your life ever been quietly erased? What would it mean to bring their story back into the light if this story touched something in you? Don't let it end here. Subscribe to Heart Stories for more stories that remember the forgotten, speak for the silent, and honor the unseen.